Hey there, I'm Sarah, survivor, speaker, author, and clarity coach. I teach women how to leave abuse behind and get safe, stable, and strong. And I want to invite you to join me right now in my Jesus bubble for a gentle, quiet moment that's good for your soul. Right now, I have been reading through this fabulous book called Hinds on High Places. I'll drop a link underneath if you would like to grab your copy and read along. And it's the perfect type of nourishing, supportive, gently spiritual thing to share with a friend. You want to hit share, hit like, give me a comment underneath. That helps other people to be able to join us and enjoy too. So right now, our protagonist, Much Afraid, that's her name, she is very much afraid, has just started her journey in the care of two guides named Sorrow and Suffering that have been given to her by the chief shepherd. She wants to no longer have lame, crippled feet and a twisted mouth and all of the blemishes and the things, that give her a sense of being frozen. And the shepherd has promised to give her hinds feet where she can leap on the mountains. It's a bit of a fantasy allegory, but it's so powerful and beautiful with all of the spiritual lessons for our own journeys through fear and suffering. So right now, she has just started climbing the mountains in the foothills with Sorrow and Suffering, twin sisters that are her guides. From the very beginning, the way up the mountain proved to be steeper than anything Much Afraid had supposed herself to be capable of tackling. And it was not very long before she was forced to seek the help of her companions. Each time she shrinkingly took the hold of the hand of either Sorrow or Suffering, a pang went through her. But once their hands were grasped, she found that they had amazing strength and seemed able to pull and even lift her upwards and over places which she would have considered utterly impossible to reach. Indeed, without their aid, they would have been impossible to reach, even for a strong and sure-footed person. It was not very long, too, before she began to realize how much help she needed in another way. For it was not only the steepness of the climb and her own lameness and weakness which made the journey difficult. To her surprise and distress, she found there were enemies to meet on the way who would have certainly succeeded in making her turn back if she had been alone. To explain this, we must now go back to the Valley of Humiliation and her village to see what was happening there. Great was the wrath and consternation of the whole fearing clan when it was discovered that Much Afraid had made her escape from the valley, and that she had actually gone off to the mountains in the company of the shepherd they so much hated. So long as she had just been ugly, crippled, and miserable little Much Afraid, her relatives had cared nothing about her. Now they found it quite intolerable that of them all, she alone should be singled out in this way and taken to live on the high places. Perhaps she would be given service in the palace of the great king himself. Do you ever feel like this happens when you start to grow? When you begin to change? When you begin to find things that are healthy? When you start to leave behind fear, being frozen, bending to everyone else's will, where they may have not cared at all about you before. Now, oh my goodness, I'm sorry for the yawns this morning. Now, though, goodness, they want to tear you down. You become forefront in their minds. Who was Much Afraid that this should happen to her while the rest of the family drudged away in the Valley of Humiliation? It was not that they wanted to go to the mountains themselves, far be it, but it was intolerable that Much Afraid should do so. So it happened that instead of being a little nobody in the eyes of her relatives, Much Afraid had suddenly become the central figure of their interest and thought. Not only was her own immediate circle of fearing relatives concerned about the matter, but all of her more distant connections as well. Indeed, the whole population of the valley, apart from the king's own servants, were angered by her departure, and determined that by some means she must be brought back. The hated shepherd must be robbed of his success in filching her from them. A great consultation went on between all the more influential relatives, and ways and means discussed by which she could be captured most effectively and be brought back to the valley as a permanent slave. Finally, it was agreed that someone must be sent after her as quickly as possible in order to force her to return. But they could not conceal from themselves that force might prove impossible, and apparently she had put herself under the protection of the great shepherd, so some means then would have to be found to beguile her into leaving him of her own free will. How could this be accomplished? In the end, it was unanimously decided to send a distant connection of the family named Pride. The choice fell on him for several reasons. First, he was not only very strong and powerful, but he was also a handsome young man, and when he chose, he could be extremely attractive. It was emphasized that if other means proved unsuccessful, he was to feel no scruples against exerting all of his powers of fascination in order to coax Much Afraid away from the shepherd. Besides, it was a well-known fact that the young man was by nature far too proud to admit defeat or lack of success in any undertaking, and that there would be no giving up on his part until he accomplished his purpose. As everybody knew, to confess defeat and return without Much Afraid would be the last thing possible to young Pride. So when he consented to undertake the task, it was felt that the matter was as good as settled. Much Afraid and her two companions, therefore, had been only a few days upon their journey, and had made but slow, though steady, progress, when one morning, on turning a corner of the rocky pathway, Pride was seen striding toward them. She was certainly surprised and discomfited at this unexpected apparition, but not unduly alarmed. This cousin had always so disdained and ignored her very existence that at first it never occurred to her that he would even speak to her. But she expected to see him pass by in the usual haughty manner. Pride himself, who had been skulking and spying for several hours before he showed himself, was on his part delighted to find that though Much Afraid seemed to be traveling in the care of two strong companions, yet the shepherd himself was not with her. He approached her, therefore, quite confidently, but with the most unusual affability of manner, and to Much Afraid's great surprise, stopped when they met. And he greeted her. "Well, Cousin Much Afraid, here you are at last. I have had such ado to catch up with you." "How do you do, Cousin Pride?" said the poor little simpleton. Much Afraid, of course, ought to have known better than to greet, much less to stop and talk with one of her own relatives from the valley. But it is rather pleasant, after being snubbed and ignored for years, to suddenly be greeted as an equal. Besides this, her curiosity was awakened. Of course, had it been that awful and detestable Craven, nothing would have induced her to stop and speak with him. "Much Afraid," said Pride seriously, actually taking her hand in a kindly and friendly manner. It so happened that at that place the path was not quite so steep, and she had freed her hands from those of both sorrow and suffering. "I have made this journey on purpose to try and help you. I do beg you to allow me to do so and to listen very attentively and seriously. My dear cousin, you must give up this extraordinary journey and come back with me to the valley. You don't realize the true position in which you have put yourself, nor the dreadful future before you. The one who has persuaded you to start this improper journey," Pride could not even bring himself to mention the shepherd by name, "is well known to have seduced other helpless victims in the same way. Do you know what will happen to you, Much Afraid, if you persist in going forward? All those fair promises he has made about bringing you into his kingdom and making you live happily ever after will prove false. When he gets you up to the wild, desolate parts of the mountains, he will abandon you altogether, and you will be put to lasting shame. Poor Much Afraid tried to pull her hand away, for now she began to understand the meaning of his presence there and his bitter hatred of the shepherd. But as she struggled to free her hand, he only grasped it tighter. She had to learn that once pride is listened to struggle as one may, it is the hardest thing in the world to throw him off. She hated the things that he said, but with her hand grasped in his, they had the power to sound horribly plausible and true. Did she not often find herself, in her heart of hearts, thrusting back the same idea and possibility which pride was suggesting to her? Even if the shepherd did not abandon her, and that she could not believe, might it not be that he who did allow sorrow and suffering to be her companions would also allow her, for her soul's good, of course, to be put to shame before all of her relatives and connections? Was she not almost certainly exposing herself to ridicule? Who could know what the shepherd might allow her to go through, for her ultimate good perhaps, but quite unbearable to contemplate. It is a terrible thing to let pride take one by the hand, Much Afraid suddenly discovered. His suggestions are so frightfully strong, and through the contact of touch, he can press them home with an almost irresistible force. Come back, Much Afraid, he urged vehemently. Give it up before it's too late. In your heart of hearts, you know that what I'm saying is true, and you will be put to shame before everybody. Give it up while there's still time. Is a merely fictitious promise of living on the high places worth the cost you are asked to pay for it? What is it that you seek here? Let me try again. What is it that you seek there, in that mythological kingdom above? Entirely against her will, and simply because he seemed to have her at his mercy, Much Afraid let the words be dragged out of her. I am seeking the kingdom of love, she said faintly. I thought as much, sneered Pride. Seeking your heart's desire, eh? And now, Much Afraid, have a little pride. Ask yourself honestly, are you not so ugly and deformed that nobody even in the valley really loves you? That's the brutal truth. Then how much less will you be welcome in the kingdom of love, where they say nothing but unblemished beauty and perfection is admitted? Can you really expect to find what you are seeking? No, I tell you again that you feel this yourself and you know it. Then at least be honest and give it up. Turn back with me before it is too late. Poor Much Afraid. Excuse me, I'm tired this morning. The urge to turn back seemed almost irresistible, but at that moment, when she stood, held in the clutch of pride, feeling as though every word he spoke was the hideous truth, she had an inner vision of the face of the shepherd. She remembered the look with which he had promised her, I pledge myself to bring you there, and that you shall not be put to shame. Then it was as though she heard him again, repeating softly, as though looking at some radiant vision in the distance, Behold, thou art fair, my love. Thou hast dove's eyes. Thou art all fair, my love. There is no spot in thee. Before Pride could realize what was happening, Much Afraid uttered a desperate cry for help and was calling up the mountain, Come to me, shepherd, come quickly. Make no tarrying, my lord. There was a sound of loose rattling stones and of a prodigious leap, and the next moment the shepherd was on the path beside him, his face terrible to look at, his shepherd's staff raised high above his head. Only one blow fell, and then Pride dropped the hand he had been grasping so tightly, and made off down the path and round the corner, slipping and stumbling on the stones as he went, and was out of sight in a moment. Much Afraid, said the shepherd, in a tone of gentle but firm rebuke. Why did you let Pride come up to you and take your hand? If you had been holding the hands of your two helpers, this could never have happened. For the first time, Much Afraid, of her own free will, held out both hands to her two companions, and they grasped her strongly, but never before had their hold upon her been so full of pain, so bitter with sorrow. She learned in this way the first important lesson on her journey upward, that if one stops to parley with pride and listens to his poisonous suggestions, and above all, if he is allowed to lay his grasp upon any part of one, sorrow becomes unspeakably more unbearable afterward, and anguish of heart has bitterness added to it. Moreover, for a while she limped more painfully than ever she had since leaving the valley. Pride had trodden on her feet at the moment she called for help, and left them more lame and sore than ever. Tomorrow, we will read about Much Afraid's detour through the desert. And I want to ask you, what has your experience been with pride? Have you found that when you are struggling with doing what you know to be right, does your heart ever just grasp onto those ideas of telling yourself, oh, this is never going to work out? I'm probably just going to be humiliated and embarrassed because of this. God's never going to come through for me. That only happens for other people. It's pride talking. A little bit inside out and inverted. We normally think of pride as taking ourselves and puffing ourselves up and making ourselves so much more important than others. But sometimes pride speaks to us through fear of embarrassment and fear of shame. It's the same root, just a different expression. Different leaves, same tree. I would love to hear your thoughts underneath in a comment. And if you want to grab your book and read along with me, I will drop a link to where you can grab the book on Amazon underneath. Also, if you've been stumbling along in your own healing journey after trauma, after divorce, after separation, after abuse, I would love to have you come join my monthly group coaching club called The Scoop. It's where we work together to find the next right steps so that you can have clarity and confidence and freedom on your way forward. I'll see you tomorrow.